After Gregory Onyedikachi was rushed to the hospital, Miriam Adesina sat in the waiting area, her hands tightly clasped together as she whispered desperate prayers. Her heart pounded against her chest, her breath coming in quick, uneven gasps. Fear gripped her entire being, making it impossible to sit still. Her fingers trembled as she wiped the sweat forming on her forehead. The antiseptic scent of the hospital mixed with the faint beeping of machines in the distance only heightened her anxiety. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Finally, the doctor emerged from the emergency ward, his expression grim. Miriam jumped to her feet, her eyes wide with hope and fear. "Doctor, please," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Is he going to be okay?" The doctor let out a heavy sigh, his gaze filled with sorrow. "His cells are getting weaker," he said, his tone low. "Right now he needs to be around his loved ones. It might help." Miriam's legs nearly gave out beneath her, but she forced herself to remain standing. Tears welled up in her eyes, her chest tightening painfully. She had never felt so helpless before. Her mind raced. Who could she call? Who else would come to be by Gregory's side? Would he even make it through the night? She shook her head, refusing to let doubt take over. "He will be fine," she whispered to herself. "He has to be." Hey guys, please do well to subscribe to support our growth. Thank you for watching. Gregory Onyedikachi had been discharged, but he might as well have stayed in the hospital for all the life left in him. He barely spoke. He barely moved. He just sat in his penthouse, staring out the massive window, watching the world go on as if his hadn't just come crashing down. Miriam Adesina observed him from a distance, arms folded, her own emotions tangled in a web of guilt, concern, and something else she didn't dare name. She had seen this kind of emptiness before, only in those who had given up, and that was something she refused to let him do. She let out a breath, steadying herself before stepping forward. "Are you planning to say anything ever again, or is staring out windows your new hobby?" she asked, her voice laced with forced sarcasm. Miriam Adesina watched him from a distance, her heart aching. He had always been kind to her in his own quiet way. The little things, asking if she had eaten, noticing when she was tired, treating her with a respect she never expected. He never demanded gratitude, never acted entitled. Now, seeing him so withdrawn, so distant, she knew she couldn't just stand by. He had been good to her, and she owed him something in return. She took a deep breath, gripping the hem of her dress as determination filled her heart. She had made up her mind. She would give him the one thing he truly desired, the one thing she had been too afraid to offer before. Miriam stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Gregory," she called. He didn't turn, but she saw the slight movement of his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched against the armrest. He had heard her. "I know you're hurting," she continued, moving closer. "And I know I can't take that pain away. But please, let me be here for you. Let me give you what you've always wanted." Silence filled the room. Then, finally, he turned to face her, his eyes heavy with emotions she couldn't quite read. "Why now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miriam swallowed, her own emotions threatening to choke her. "Because you deserve it. Because I see you, and because I want to." For the first time in weeks, something flickered in his eyes, hope, hesitation, maybe even longing. Miriam held her breath, waiting, praying he would let her in. That night, after dinner, Gregory lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling as if waiting for it to offer him some kind of revelation. The room was still, save for the quiet hum of the city beyond his window. He exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face, exhaustion pressing into his bones. He hadn't expected much from the night, just another endless loop of thoughts he couldn't outrun. And then the door opened. Miriam stepped inside, and for a second, he thought he was imagining things. She wasn't dressed in her usual simple attire. No, this was something different. The silky fabric clung to her frame in a way that demanded attention, the dim lighting accentuating the curves she so often hid. If she was nervous, she didn't show it, except for the way she hesitated just inside the doorway, her fingers toying with the edge of the fabric as if second-guessing herself. Gregory sat up slightly, his brows drawing together. "You're either really bad at sneaking in, or you want me to see you," he murmured, his voice low, edged with a flicker of amusement crossed his face, but it disappeared just as quickly. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Miriam, you don't have to do this." "Oh, I know." She took a step forward, and something in his chest tightened. "But I'm not here because I have to." Gregory watched her, his expression carefully guarded. "Then why?" She rolled her eyes, as if annoyed that he would even ask. "Because you think too much. Because you sit here night after night, staring at nothing, pretending you're fine when we both know you're not. Because you've been good to me in ways you probably don't even realize." She inhaled deeply, meeting his gaze. "And maybe, just maybe, I want to be good to you too." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Miriam, stop overthinking." She took another step, then another, until she was standing right beside his bed. "Just for once, let someone do something for you without you trying to talk them out of it." He exhaled a shaky breath, his fingers twitching against the sheets. "And what if I take this? What if I take you?" She arched a brow. "Then maybe you'll finally realize you don't have to carry everything alone." Silence stretched between them, thick, charged. Then, slowly, Gregory reached out, his fingertips brushing against her wrist, before sliding down to lace with hers. His grip was warm, hesitant. Miriam didn't pull away, and when he finally tugged her forward, when their lips met in a slow, searching kiss, she knew. This wasn't just about obligation. It was about something unspoken, something real. Gregory's lips lingered against hers, the hesitation in his touch betraying the war waging inside him. This wasn't just a moment of impulse, not for either of them. He was holding back, as if afraid that accepting her now would make him lose the last shred of control he had left. Miriam pulled back just slightly, her breath mingling with his. "You don't have to treat me like I'm going to break, Gregory," she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. His jaw clenched, his grip on her hand firm but careful. "I'm not afraid of breaking you, Miriam," he admitted, voice hoarse. "I'm afraid I won't be able to stop once I start." She let out a soft chuckle, tilting her head as she studied him. "Maybe that's the problem. You're always trying to stop yourself from feeling anything too much, from wanting too much." Her free hand came up, tracing along his jawline, feeling the tension there. "Maybe, for once, you should stop fighting it." Gregory let out a slow breath, like he was unraveling in real time. Then, in one smooth motion, he pulled her onto his lap, his hands settling on her waist, warm and grounding. Miriam gasped, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the sheer intensity of his presence, the way his touch sent a shiver up her spine. "You say that like you know what you're asking for," he murmured, his lips hovering just over hers. She smirked. "Oh, I do." That was all the encouragement he needed. His hands roamed up her back, pulling her closer as his lips captured hers again, this time with more certainty, more purpose. The kiss deepened, slow but consuming, igniting something between them that neither of them could deny anymore. Miriam melted into him, her fingers threading through his hair, her body pressing against his. The room around them faded, the doubts, the hesitation, the weight of everything that had brought them here. There was only this, only them. Gregory's hands roamed lower, his breath uneven as he traced the delicate fabric draping over her body. His voice was barely above a whisper when he spoke next. "If we do this, there's no going back." Miriam met his gaze, unwavering. I was never planning to. And with that, whatever restraint he had been holding on to shattered. He pulled her against him, his lips trailing down her neck, his hands exploring every inch of her with a reverence that sent warmth blooming in her chest. Miriam sighed into his touch, letting him take his time, letting the moment unfold between them like something fragile and powerful all at once. Every touch, every kiss was a silent promise, a vow neither of them had spoken aloud, but both understood. Tonight wasn't just about comfort, it was about belonging. And as they surrendered to the gravity pulling them together, Miriam realized something. Maybe she hadn't just come here for him. Maybe she had needed this just as much. Miriam woke up to the warmth of Gregory's arms wrapped securely around her. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting golden rays over the room, making the moment feel surreal. Her head rested against his bare chest, listening to the steady rise and fall of his breath. The night before had been unlike anything she had ever experienced, intimate, raw, and filled with emotions she couldn't quite put into words. She swallowed, her thoughts swirling as she traced light circles over his skin with her fingertips. She had given herself to him, not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because in that moment it had felt right. It had felt inevitable. Gregory had always been more than just a man she worked for, more than someone she admired from a distance. And now, she had crossed a line she could never uncross. Gregory stirred beside her, his arms instinctively tightening around her waist as he pulled her closer. His lips brushed against her forehead in a lazy, affectionate gesture. "Morning," he murmured, his voice still heavy with sleep. Miriam hesitated before responding, unsure of how to navigate this new reality. "Good morning," she whispered, shifting slightly to look up at him. Gregory propped himself up on one elbow, studying her face, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name, something deep, something almost vulnerable. His fingers brushed against her cheek, as if memorizing every detail. "How do you feel?" She hesitated, her heart pounding. How did she feel? It was a question she wasn't sure she had an answer to. Instead, she settled for the truth. "Strange. Different." Gregory chuckled softly, a small, knowing smile playing at his lips. "I expected that." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Miriam lowered her gaze, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Gregory." She hesitated, still unused to saying his name so freely. "What happens now?" He exhaled deeply and reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Now, we see if last night gave us what we both hoped for." His thumb brushed against the back of her hand. "And no matter what happens, Miriam, I want you to know something." She looked up at him, searching his face. "What?" "You're not alone in this," he said firmly. "You never will be." Her chest tightened at the sincerity in his voice, but even as she nodded, a part of her wondered if he truly believed that. Time was not on their side. Weeks passed, and with each day, Miriam became more aware of the changes in her body. The exhaustion that clung to her like an invisible weight, the way certain smells made her stomach turn, the unfamiliar tightness in her abdomen, it all pointed to one undeniable truth. And so, that morning, she found herself standing in the small bathroom, a pregnancy test clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The two bold lines stared back at her, confirming what she had suspected all along. She was pregnant. Her breath hitched as she gripped the edge of the sink for support. A whirlwind of emotions crashed over her, fear, excitement, and an overwhelming ache for the man who had desperately prayed for this child, knowing he might not live long enough to see them grow. She swallowed hard, pressing a protective hand against her stomach. "Gregory," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She knew she had to tell him. This was the 5th month since the doctors had marked his time, the 5th month of holding on, of praying for more days, for one more chance to hold on to life. Lying in bed, he whispered his prayers into the silence. "Just a little longer," he murmured, his fingers gripping the sheets. "Let me stay long enough to see what my life was meant for." But fate had its own way of answering. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice steady despite the weight in his chest. Miriam stepped inside hesitantly, her hands clasped together as she approached him. He frowned, immediately noticing the paleness in her face, the slight tremble in her fingers. "Miriam," he said softly, concern filling his voice. "You look pale. Are you feeling all right?" She took a shaky breath, stepping closer. I have something to tell you." Gregory's heart pounded in his chest. He already knew. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she held herself. Still, he needed to hear her say it. "Is it—" His voice faltered, his breath shallow. She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm pregnant." A choked sound escaped his lips, a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming emotion. He stood slowly, his body feeling both weightless and impossibly heavy all at once. "Miriam." He whispered her name like a prayer, like a lifeline. She reached for him, placing his hands over her stomach, letting him feel the life they had created. "You prayed for this," she said, her voice trembling. "And now it's real." Gregory swallowed thickly, his fingers trembling as they traced over her abdomen. A wave of emotion crashed over him, raw and uncontainable. He looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I promised you, didn't I?" His voice was rough with emotion. "I promised I'd love you both with every breath I have left." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "And I promised we'd stick together, no matter what." Something inside him cracked open. A deep, overwhelming emotion flooded through him, one he hadn't allowed himself to feel in so long. Hope. His vision blurred as he reached for her, pulling her into his arms. "You have no idea what this means to me," he whispered into her hair. "I prayed for this, Miriam. For something to keep me here. For something to fight for." She held on to him, her own emotions swirling in a storm too big to contain. "Then fight, Gregory," she murmured. "Fight to stay with us." His hands slid down to her stomach, trembling slightly as he placed them over the small but growing life within her. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Your father is here." Tears slipped down Miriam's cheeks as she covered his hands with hers. "We'll be together, right? No matter what happens?" Gregory cupped her face, his thumb gently wiping away the stray tear. "No matter what. I swear to you, Miriam, I will love you both with every breath I have left." She nodded, pressing her forehead against his, their breaths mingling in the quiet promise. They stood there, wrapped in the warmth of their love and the silent promises that neither time nor fate could take from them, but promises could only hold back time for so long. A few days later, it happened. The illness had always been lurking, waiting to strike. That morning, Gregory had seemed tired, more than usual. He smiled, held her close, and whispered about the future. But by afternoon, the weakness had taken over. His breath had become shallow, his grip weaker. And by nightfall, he lay in their bed, struggling for the life he had fought so hard to hold on to. Miriam sat beside him, her hands clutching his, as if she could anchor him to this world. "Gregory, please, don't leave me," she choked out, tears falling freely. His fingers brushed over hers, a ghost of a smile on his lips. "Miriam, don't cry for me," he whispered. "I've had more love in these last months than I ever thought possible." She shook her head violently, unable to accept the words. "We need you." He coughed, his body trembling. "You have me, always." With effort, he reached for the small box on the bedside table and placed it in her hands. "Open it," Through her tears, Miriam's shaking fingers undid the ribbon. Inside, a delicate gold necklace gleamed in the dim light. A single charm hung from it, an intricate infinity symbol, a promise unbroken. "This is my vow to you," Gregory whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "Every time you wear it, remember our promise. We are forever." A sob tore from her throat as she clutched the necklace to her chest. "I don't want a reminder, Gregory. I want you." He smiled weakly. "You have me, love. In every sunrise, in our child's eyes, in the love I leave behind." And with one final, ragged breath, he closed his eyes. Miriam let out a shattered cry, her body collapsing over his as the realization hit her like 1,000 knives. The man she loved, the father of her unborn child, was gone. But his love remained. In the life he left inside her, in the necklace pressed against her trembling skin, in the unspoken promise that even death could never break. Miriam sat in the quiet of their bedroom, the weight of Gregory's necklace resting against her chest. The soft gold charm was warm from her touch, a reminder of the promise they had made, the love that neither time nor death could take away. Her hands instinctively moved to her growing belly, where the last piece of Gregory still lived. Their child, his legacy, a part of him she would carry forever. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she no longer wept from sorrow alone. Yes, she had lost him, but in a way, she had gained something too, a love so deep, so unbreakable, that even in death, it remained. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes. "I will make sure our child knows you, Gregory," she whispered. "Knows your love, your strength, your kindness. You will never just be a memory." A soft breeze drifted through the open window, brushing against her skin like an unseen embrace. And in that moment, she knew. He was still with her. Always. As she looked toward the future, she vowed to keep moving forward, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. Because love like theirs didn't fade. It lived on in every heartbeat, in every sunrise, in every whispered promise carried by the wind. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming and emotional stories. Your support means the world to us. Stay tuned for more captivating tales.